Before I start, I want to thank my PhD committee for being there for this entire 4-year process and supporting me throughout all the research that I've done. And that is the 4 faces that you see on the screen, which I think are more important than mine because I wouldn't be here without them. That's Tom, who just spoke, Jae-Young Park, who is online on live stream, watching this from South Korea with his students, Ying-Cheng Lai, and David Alderson from the Naval Postgraduate School. I just want to say thank you all for coming. This is an amazing turnout for a PhD dissertation defense, and thank you all online for participating in this. And I hope that you enjoy this presentation and can stay for the whole 35-40-minute presentation that I'm about to give. I want to start talking about my dissertation on how to think about resilient infrastructure systems by showing a picture of Hurricane Katrina to give you an idea of the kinds of disasters and issues that we're trying to deal with. Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 was a major disaster, and it led to the realization that risk and risk-based risk analysis, risk thinking, wasn't necessarily working anymore because we just couldn't plan for these massive hurricanes and levee failures that were leading to destructions of entire cities. And that event and other events like it led to what I'm referring to in this presentation as the infrastructure resilience renaissance. So Hurricane Katrina was exacerbated by infrastructure failures. And we want, as infrastructure people, civil engineers, environmental engineers, and other experts, want to design infrastructure systems to better deal with these kinds of problems. And so from early as 1997, about 20 years ago, people started looking at resilient infrastructure to try and think of ways of improving upon and changing the way we're dealing with risk and disasters. So all the way from the Presidential Commission looking at critical foundations and the ways in which failures can cascade across infrastructure systems, cause really big disruptions from really small problems, to initial theories about how those failures occur and how we can manage infrastructure in the early 2000s, to the late 2000s when the National Institute of Standards and Technology and other organizations were making big frameworks trying to think about all the ways urban systems and infrastructures work together, to when I first started looking at this problem in about 2012, 2013, when you already had the National Academies of Science, National Research Council, the Office of the President of the United States, the Department of Homeland Security, the United Nations talking about infrastructure resilience and now making directives for essentially the entire world and nations to be pursuing this as something that we should be applying in the way we manage and pursue infrastructure. And when I first started, and largely today, there's a essentially codified consensus on how we should be thinking about infrastructure resilience. And that is best exemplified by this National Academy of Sciences definition of resilience, which is the ability to plan and prepare for, absorb, recover from, and adapt to adverse events. So the actual wording of the definitions in the UN documents and other organizations are slightly different, but the main idea is there, and it's all represented by this one model known as the critical functionality curve. So critical function, if you're a power system, for example, is making sure that you can deliver power to the public. And when you're planning and preparing for failures, everything is okay and you're meeting your standards, you're meeting demand. When a failure occurs, you absorb damages, you lose function over time. Hopefully, you then can recover from those damages, get back to where you used to be, and then adapt to systems afterwards to try and either improve your capacity to deal with the same kinds of failures or different kinds of failures, or at least get back to the same kind of delivery and services that you provided before. And this is a very powerful and prevalent way of thinking about infrastructure resilience, largely because it's also easy to think about measures for infrastructure resilience from it, which is essentially just this region within this curve. If you can shrink this basin or this little bathtub that's being generated by the critical functionality curve to either be flat or smaller, you're clearly a more resilient system because you can absorb damages better, you can recover faster, your planning and preparing is going better than it used to be, and you're adapting more to different kinds of problems. And this is a very prevalent way that infrastructure resilience is thought of in the literature today still. And even recently, it's been related to the original thoughts about risk analysis and risk management that was codified as early as the 1980s, where risk, which is the confluence of threat, vulnerability, and consequences, is essentially a single point on this curve. So the way that people think about resilience often in the literature and in applications in the real world is like the time integral of risk and how we deal with these kinds of problems. And my dissertation takes this as a starting point and says, instead of thinking about this critical functionality curve and resilience as an extension of the risk analytic paradigm, it's actually more important to think about it as it's based on risk. And because it's based on risk, it's not necessarily a new concept, and we're just getting to the points where we're reaching the limitations of thinking about things in a risk way. And the next couple of slides are to demonstrate how we've essentially got to diminishing returns on risk management using this approach that people are calling resilience. So back in 1997, when resilience was first starting to get looked at, Northern California experienced the largest evacuation in its history when the Feather River flooded due to large water releases from the Oroville Dam north of the Feather River and levee failures in the Feather River. Well, we learned how to plan and prepare for those kinds of problems, so when significant amounts of rain and water was experienced in 2017, they were already prepared to use primary spillways in different kinds of ways, but the actual dam started to fail, which almost led to a dam collapse that no one was prepared for. So even though we're thinking about resilience and trying to change the way we plan and prepare for the same kinds of failures that we're used to experiencing, we're still not used to experiencing these surprising failures that could lead to bigger problems, because the and the evacuation in 1997 was only exceeded by this year's evacuation. And if the dam actually did collapse, it would have put 30 feet of water in Sacramento in 30 hours. So that would have been a terrible loss that was never experienced before. When it comes to absorbing damages, back in 2003, when people were starting to make the theories about how resilience works, Southern California experienced the biggest, most damaging fire in California history, the Cedar Fire, which caused about 2,800 structures to be destroyed and 15 people to die. And this was only exceeded this year by the Tubbs Fire in October up in Napa Valley, when 5,100 structures were destroyed and 22 people perished, notwithstanding current fires that are going on in Southern California people are reading about right now. So the same kinds of events are causing even more damages than we experienced in the past. When it comes to recovering, we're not doing so much better with following this current resilience and risk analytic paradigm either, where the largest blackout in Northern American history was the Northeast blackout in 2003, which caused a blackout of 55 million people were affected. It only took on the order of a couple weeks for everyone to get electricity back online. Where Hurricane Maria and Irma, most recently, that took out Puerto Rico, it's taking over 2 months and still isn't fully recovered from that blackout event. And in fact, Puerto Rico has experienced its 2 worst blackouts in the last couple of months because during the recovery processes for getting their grid back online, infrastructure failed and caused a major blackout within the entire island again. So if you look at the image for the Northeast blackout, Puerto Rico is just a small little dot on the entire map, but it's experiencing significantly more failures than they did back in 2003. And lastly, when it comes to adapting, Hurricane Katrina is essentially an event that everyone in the United States and every city in the United States is aware of and trying to prevent and plan and change the way they deal with problems for the future. And Hurricane Harvey is actually causing projected greater economic impacts due to the same kinds of failures. A sudden, large hurricane with more water than was ever predicted, and levee failures and bad construction policies that made it so many, many houses were affected when the levees were overtopped and got destroyed. So essentially, we're reaching the diminishing returns on this approach to trying to protect and deal with infrastructure failures as they occur for these large disasters and any other kinds of problems they may experience, where we're having worse buffering, worse damages, longer recovery, and less function or less adaptation over time. And so the only thing that we've really gotten consensus on from this 20-plus years of research that's occurred is that we're not getting any better. We need a new way to think about these things. And so the main contribution from my dissertation is a new way to think about resilience that is distinct from risk and will hopefully get us to start planning, preparing, absorbing, or other kinds of things to improve infrastructure's response to these large-scale disasters. To do that, we need to take a step back now from the critical functionality curve, and we need to start just thinking about the way that people think about infrastructure resilience and infrastructure systems. So this is a model of how people do research and how people think about science, how people go and apply resilience in practice, where you have some stuff in the rest of the world, and then you have a systems model that is in your head that includes elements of the real world, maybe from data or like a real infrastructure system, and then elements of your own, that is your own personal take or something special you're adding to it. The infrastructure system that is within your systems model interacts with the rest of the world through what we call sensing processes. So sensing processes in an infrastructure system are just like sensing processes that you would have as a person. So if smoke were to enter this room, you would smell it. You wouldn't necessarily see it, and that's how you would sense smoke. You'd start thinking, okay, there's smoke in the room. Why is there smoke in this PhD dissertation defense? That would then leads to anticipating processes, where you smell the smoke and it gives you an idea of where the smoke might be coming from. Maybe it's a fire, maybe it's dangerous. You might think, okay, there's a kitchen nearby, maybe something's burning in the kitchen. And you then leads to thinking about what you might do, and having a model of what smoke is related to and what it leads to then leads to what we call adapting processes, where people are actually taking action. Like you get up and go check the smoke, you check the kitchen, and when you go to the kitchen, that adaptation leads to some form of learning, where you then interact with the rest of the world and you find out, oh, there's no fire, I just found out that people smoke in this building, right? So the smoke that you were smelling is not what you thought before. You now have a new mental model of what goes on within this building, what was going on during that dissertation defense. And all of these processes happen within infrastructure systems. So when a power grid, people have access to information about who's turning lights on, who needs electricity, what the temperature is outside. They have all these sensors that are sensing that information that then lead them to anticipate how much electricity they should be producing, where it should be produced, who's going to be using it, and then take action by actually changing which generators are on or off, which power lines are active, which parts of the system are available, and having this feedback with the city, they can then learn over time what's the best way to deal with these kinds of problems. And when infrastructure problems occur, the same types of things also occur. They sense the failures that may happen, they sense the ways they should be changing systems, and then they learn from those failures over time. My dissertation is focusing on these processes and trying to better understand how these processes are working for resilience in infrastructure systems, where the second chapter of my dissertation is focused on data and data analytics, which have to do with sensing processes. This third chapter of my dissertation is focusing on goals and strategies that people use for adapting infrastructure systems to deal with problems. And then the last couple of chapters are focusing on different ways of anticipating these problems and how models are used to try and think about and change the way in which we manage future disasters that we might not be able to predict. So starting with sensing processes for infrastructure resilience, there's three essential ways in which data and data analytics are used currently in infrastructure resilience literature and in practice. And those are descriptive data analytics to tell you what is happening, who's using power, who's driving on the roads right now. Predictive analytics about who might be driving, who might be using power in the future based off that information. And then prescriptive analytics about what you should do with that information and how you should change your system or change the way the infrastructure is being used to improve the way in which you might handle these problems. And through the use of these analytics, the ideal situation is that we're able to better predict crises before they occur. We can better decide how we're going to, we can better understand the damage they may cause, and we can better decide how to choose which things we should be turning on and off, which ways we are going to accept those damages to then absorb and recover them better. The problem is that these analytics that are currently being developed are kind of stuck within this risk analytic paradigm that I was showing you before, which leads to some issues in the way that they're being applied that make it so we can't actually handle these surprising disasters like Hurricane Katrina. So for example, descriptive analytics are just confusing in general and don't necessarily help make decisions when they're being presented to the public or presented to experts. So many of us have seen these kind of hurricane maps over the last hurricane season. Well, if you were looking at it without that white line down the middle, you might think that the entirety of Florida is in a terrible condition because it's within hurricane winds. And then like multiple Floridas on top of that are also experiencing potential damages because of the tropical storm winds. Where in reality, the white line is exactly where Irma went, and that's the area of most destruction, which if you look at the map, kind of just cut the needle right between multiple urban centers, causing minimal damages by actually taking that path. So making decisions about this and using this kind of information is really difficult when it could be destroying your town or doing absolutely nothing. Similarly, predictive analytics about what the destruction might be are flawed and limited because they're made with a mental model about the world before we actually experience these events. So another hurricane that happened this hurricane season was Hurricane Ophelia, which went all the way to Ireland. And as it turns out, the U.S. National Hurricane Center's models don't go that far north or that far east. So there's just this jagged predictive model that you can't actually know what's going to happen after it hits landfall in England and the UK. And so there's limitations in the way in which we're developing both descriptive and predictive models. And lastly, these prescriptive analytics, even if we have them, aren't necessarily being used, and they might be being used in the wrong ways. And one example is just in Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Harvey, both of these events were considered like the most anticipated disaster in history before they occurred. So if you look at news articles even and research articles about the potential damages of these events prior to 2005 or prior to 2017, people are already talking about the damages they're going to experience, but no one necessarily acted upon that information even though they had it. So the issue that we raise in this chapter and the thing that we think is going on is that we're stuck in what's we're calling the analytics loop, where we are developing models, different kinds of data analytics, that we then predict how the world is going to work, we observe them, we statistically test them, and then we use some form of empirical falsification to improve them or to make a whole new model or change how we think about it. But when we're stuck in this loop, we're not necessarily using anything like imagination or new visions to try and change the way we even think about hurricanes or how we should be modeling them in the first place. And because of that, we're stuck in this smaller loop, and this is actually a model of the entire scientific process, where we're not getting to a point where we can have new imagination, new pre-analytic models that then lead to new theories and new ways that we can deal with surprises before they occur. And what we're saying in this chapter, me and my co-authors, is that analytics are helpful, but they're not everything. And resilience requires that we be able to change the analytics to deal with new kinds of problems, and that we have better imagination and better heuristics for dealing with when these models are not going to work and make decisions in situations when they're complete surprises, just like Hurricane Harvey and all the other hurricanes we experienced this year, and fires and other damages. And so the next chapter, chapter 3, is looking at, okay, so if we have now a view of analytics and heuristics and the way in which they interact with each other, how can we then use that to start thinking about strategies and adaptations in infrastructure systems? And to do that, I need to take another step back and start looking at how we even think about risk and resilience to try and develop what I think of as actual resilience analysis versus risk analysis. And the best way for me to describe that is to start with just the way we use the words in regular sentences in grammar. So I want to introduce you all, if you haven't seen it before, to this verb. It's a resile. It's a real verb, still in the dictionary. It's apparently common in Australia and Australian Parliament, according to Merriam-Webster's website. But it means to return to a former position, and it predates the noun version of resilience. And it's actually a negative verb. You would use resile in sentences like, I promised to do something, but I resiled. Like that's a complete sentence. So when we think about risk and resilience, we can use them as these abstract nouns, and we can use them in the sentences like I have been for the last, 10, 15 minutes already. But that doesn't necessarily help us understand how we should be thinking about resilience when we go about doing it in systems or infrastructure. So when we go to then think, okay, can we count or measure resilience? Well, as it turns out, when you use resilience as a countable noun, it's actually a grammatically incorrect sentence. You can't say, what is a resilience? That just doesn't exist. Where what is a risk is a grammatically correct sentence and does lend itself to these quantifiable measures that we currently have for dealing with infrastructure problems. On the other hand, when you try and use risk as a verb, it doesn't really work. You can't. The sentence I risked is not a grammatically correct sentence, where instead it's a linking verb or helping verb, where you can say I risk floods or I risk flooding, so you can have a specific kind of problem. On the other hand, resilience, I resiled, is a grammatically correct sentence, and I resile floods and I resile flooding are grammatically incorrect sentences. So in other words, it's important to think about resilience as a verb itself versus having any kind of quantifiable noun form, and risk as a noun itself rather than as a verb. And this comes into the way we think about risk and resilience analysis, because they're actually entirely different things, where risk focuses on the objects and the things within an infrastructure system, where if you go to the Oroville Dam example, you would ask questions like, why did the spillway break in the first place? How did it break? Is there a way to protect it from the spalling and destruction that was caused to make it so we never experience that problem? We can look at images from 2015's Google Earth, and you can find where things were breaking, and you might have been able to use risk analysis to improve how you deal with those problems. However, resilience analysis focuses entirely on actions. So a resilience analysis type question is, why did people avoid using the secondary spillway? The primary spillway in the Oroville example started failing, but they didn't start using the secondary spillway. They continued to keep using and destroying the primary spillway. If from an innocent bystander's perspective, not an expert in there, it's really confusing as to why you wouldn't just use your backup when you have it, right? So resilience analysis is looking at the actions that people take, why they would take those actions, and how that leads to either more problems or better ways of dealing with problems. There's two different strategies that we develop in this chapter, and those strategies we call robustness and extensibility. And when I say strategies now, I'm talking in the resilience analysis world. This is like a group of different kinds of actions that you can take, technologies and infrastructures that you can put in that lead to different ways of managing risk or problems in your infrastructure system. But robustness is defined as the capacity to manage increasing stressors with limited to no impact on normal activities, and fits really well within this analytic paradigm that we currently use in infrastructure systems. And it works really, really well when explicit protocols work. If you could have a checklist and follow that checklist, and doing everything on that checklist leads to you not having a massive infrastructure failure, that's following robustness. On the other hand, when design tolerances are exceeded and more water shows up than we've ever seen before, a new surprise shows up that we're not used to, then anything can happen. The dam can get overtopped, or we can survive, just like in Oroville. On the other hand, a different way of trying to design infrastructure systems to be more resilient is to look at extensibility, which is the capacity to extend existing performance when surprises challenge current capabilities. And it works really, really well when protocols don't work. Extensibility is throwing the protocols away, letting everyone do their own thing, and hope that we become more than the sum of our parts to prevent the failure from occurring. On the other hand, because everyone's doing their own thing, or people aren't necessarily coordinated or following strict rules, you could waste resources, you could work at cross purposes, you can exacerbate the damages that could actually be occurred. And that's why it fits more this heuristic understanding, because it involves more rule of thumb, personal expertise in the way other people interact with each other. And examples of this in infrastructure systems that we wrote about include focus just on traffic management for this example, where how you deal with cars going through an intersection. You could design induction loop traffic sensors that cause a magnetic field and current when a large metal object shows up like a car or a bus, and are really efficient and really effective at making sure that traffic goes through that intersection well, where if an elephant were to show up, the induction loop traffic center would not recognize it and nothing would happen, and worse traffic may occur because of it. On the other hand, if a traffic cop was standing at that intersection, they wouldn't necessarily be more efficient at managing traffic, but they would be able to handle the surprising event of an elephant showing up. They'd be able to know, okay, we need to let this elephant in like a bus or something else. And these two examples, again, emphasize this risk and data analytic approach because there's thresholds based into this induced traffic sensor approach that just the elephant will never be something that is necessarily within the minds of a traffic engineer in Phoenix, and you couldn't expect them to design systems that deal with that. Where on the other hand, the heuristic approach, police officers are really, really great at dealing with those kinds of situations, but you also need them for other tasks within the city. It takes a lot of effort to train them in the expertise to make those kinds of traffic decisions and to do those and to actually act and deal with traffic in an intersection. So you just don't have the resources to put a traffic cop at every single intersection in Phoenix. Working from this understanding of resilience now as a verb and this robustness and extensibility perspective, the idea for the rest of my dissertation is to try and expand the notion of heuristics from the individual to an entire infrastructure system. Because infrastructure systems are more than just one traffic intersection. They are the entire power grid for an entire nation sometimes. So the last two chapters of my dissertation focus on South Korea. This is a line diagram of the South Korean power grid, and these are the experts in the room who are managing it as demand changes, as information changes throughout the grid, and how they need to change the infrastructure use when crises occur or normal operations. And the idea is there's experts in this room, but there's many, many companies, many organizations, many people working together to make sure that power stays on in South Korea. And so the question is, how are they coordinating? Where do the heuristics lie? and how can they better coordinate for disasters that we've never even had before and never experienced. This is motivated by recent events that have happened in South Korea. A number of disasters have occurred that show that there might be miscommunication or slow communication for power delivery, but there's also events like earthquakes that happened in 2016 and 2017 in cities right next to each other. If you look at where that guy's hand is, that is both where Gyeongju and Pohang are in South Korea. And it turns out in 2016 the response was really, really slow because of the way in which coordination was dealt with in the protocols prior to the event. In 2017 it was much, much faster because they changed those protocols and made simple changes to the way they were sharing information to the public. So the goal is, of this heuristic understanding for power and blackout management for my work is to try and better prepare systems for these different kinds of disaster events. And lastly, I use network science as a unifying framework to try and understand both the way in which infrastructure may fail and blackouts may occur in the power grid, and the way in which organizations and individuals interact with each other to try and identify who's a coordination hub, who's dealing with the most problems, who is most important. And network science is used in both fields, social sciences, physical sciences, engineering, and this is one of the first studies that actually puts them together in some way to get a better understanding of resilience. When you do a network, this is an extremely simplified version where the power grid really has about 2,000 little dots and 4,500 of these links, and the social network is much more confusing in which organizations have partnerships with each other. But you can make a power grid network of the infrastructure and how it connects to each other and leads from generation to someone using it. And you can make a model of the organizations and their partnerships and how they coordinate for different blackout scenarios to better understand who's a centralized information sharer and hub and decision maker relative to the protocols and the way they have partnerships. And as it turns out, there's simple tools and effective mathematical tools that are used both in infrastructure and social network theory to try and identify who might be most important in terms of an organization and which infrastructure might be most important and critical for causing big failures. One thing that I dealt with this dissertation chapter is that there's actually many, many different measures for both the infrastructure side and the social side for figuring out who might be most important. And in the social network side, for example, there are many different social networks you can create of the same organizations for different blackout scenarios, and it's difficult to see, okay, who would be more important across all of them. So part of this work was to try and integrate knowledge both from the technological side and the social network side, as well as across multiple measures to get a possibilistic view of what might occur in South Korea for a large-scale blackout. And as it turns out, if you use the technological infrastructure-focused models, you can identify which organizations, which infrastructure is most critical for South Korea and might lead to large power imbalances and potentially cascading failures. On the same side, on the social network side, you can figure out, looking at multiple social networks, which organizations are the heuristic hubs and have most decision-making and coordination roles, and will have to be a really important organization, serve that purpose when blackouts occur. The problem is when you do these two studies separate, you don't actually know how to reconfigure the policies to make any kind of change and improve the way in which blackouts might be dealt with. And one of the important results from this work is this kind of combined guidance where you now can identify which organizations are critical, which organizations need to be more central or more connected, and how to connect them together. And you can hopefully eventually I'll be working with experts in South Korea and my advisor in South Korea to try and update policies for future blackout management in South Korea. And the last chapter is not just looking at the planning and preparing for when a blackout actually occurs. It's also trying to understand what goes on during a blackout to see who might be in control and whose infrastructure might be most affected as blackouts happen. In literature today, the technological and analytic view of resilience is to try and understand this pre-failure state and this final state, this last iteration 3 state, where you can see that there's multiple iterations and changes as things fail that might lead to different social situations and different organizational importance. And so by linking these two models together, we're now getting kind of a heuristic view of the world by trying to understand what's going on during the failure versus just how big is your blackout going to be kind of questions. And by combining the social network measures together and looking at in both the technological and social network measures together, we're able to then reveal new information that might be helpful for blackout management in South Korea. In particular, you see shifting coordination roles where the most central organizations for the initial failures might be in the south, but those actually shift over time as failures get worse and situations get more worse to the northwest, which is Seoul region area. So that's about 25 million people are there. And so you have a shifting importance of which regions and which organizations might be most important for helping and dealing with these problems. As well as we're trying to develop new ways to think of how organizations may extend their current capacity to deal with blackouts. And so from this extensibility view, individual transmission company, KEPCO, Korean Electric Power Corporation, essentially owns and operates all the transmission infrastructure for South Korea. So clearly they're going to be really important for any major blackout situation. But there's other organizations within South Korea that are revealed from this analysis that have either the right mix of companies within their region, or they have the right mix of assets around the nation that make them really well connected to other organizations to actually support KEPCO's role in case KEPCO needs additional support. And in this situation, I would say, K-Water, who owns all the dams in South Korea, STX, which is a private power company, or different emergency managers like Gyeonggi-do or Incheon, might have the right kind of connectivity and have the right partnerships. And if they were to extend their current capacity from instead of just focusing on their own infrastructure, but helping with transmission and other kinds of problems, we might be able to deal with these blackouts better as they occur and while they're happening. So the combination of all of this is to try and move away from this original risk analytic paradigm that is dominating resilience research for infrastructure. And the important thing is that everything is based off of risk-based thinking still today, even though we're calling it resilience and we're reaching diminishing returns. We need a new way to think. The new way to think that I'm trying to develop and have developed in this dissertation is going back to these processes for sensing, adapting, and anticipating, and expanding them to go beyond just a single analytic or way to include heuristic ways of thinking. So for sensing, we have descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive analytics, but now we have ways of thinking of heuristics and expertise and imagination and how those things might interplay for developing better sensing tools in the future. For adapting processes, robustness is kind of the focus and the way people do things today. Extensibility is another strategy that people can use. And so when reliability doesn't work anymore because thresholds are exceeded, people should actually build in extensibility to the systems to have innovation, customization, and deal with problems in new and imaginative ways, even though that also has its own problems. So these two strategies are in conflict with each other, but can be mutually supportive. And lastly, anticipating processes are extended beyond just focusing on probability or this kind of start-end, where are we going to be when the failures occur, to the possibility of how we're going to be dealing with the problems and who should be working, who should be coordinating those problems, and what's going on during cascades as they occur to try and manage the consequences after they occur. And so for me, resilience now isn't this critical functionality curve. It is the negotiation between analytics and heuristics, between robustness and extensibility, between technocentric or social types of views of the world that both give you information about how you should be dealing with problems or can deal with problems, but may be in conflict with each other, especially if you only have a set budget. And so resilience then isn't a noun about the way to plan and prepare and adapt. It's about how you can, it's a verb about how you and when you switch between different kinds of strategies. So focusing on the adapting processes, the questions would be, when would you want to go from robustness to extensibility or extensibility to robustness to better deal with these new stress conditions or surprises that will occur in the future? There's two ways that we've talked about it in my dissertation, and these are surprises, right? But there's positive surprises, when you have serendipity, and that's a lot of the stuff, positive surprises, happens on this campus or universities where extensibility is improved, or you move towards extensibility from robustness because you now have a serendipitous innovation or customization that leads to people being able to do more on their own rather than have centralized control and coordination and protocols. Where robustness actually is better than extensibility when you have these faster, better, cheaper types of drivers and you develop like a new device. Like I have plenty of friends in this room who are working on solar panels that are only possible once you reach a certain efficiency of solar panel. So this serendipitous new innovation led to a new robust way of dealing with problems. Equally, though, the ones that I've been focusing on this presentation is when calamity occurs, these strategies don't necessarily work. And so the one that we tend to see all the time because people are focusing on is robustness, and that fails when these algorithms become stale, like I showed you earlier, when tolerances are exceeded, and when stress creates negative surprise, like did in Oroville and all these other kinds of disasters. And then lastly, extensibility also isn't perfect, and it fails when people start working at cross purposes, when people act in ways and waste resources that they don't necessarily have, and when instead of becoming more than the sum of the parts, we just make the system worse off and experience greater failures. The goal of my work and the contribution that I'm trying to set forth is this new way of thinking about resilience that is distinct from risk. And the goal, I think, for the future for resilience research writ large would be to move away from this threat, vulnerability, consequence view of the world and have a better, have a new way of thinking that focuses on this verb, these actions that people take, and a new kind of radical way of defining resilience might be to adjust current actions to meet surprising stress conditions. So when should extensibility be used to meet current stress conditions, and when should we switch to robustness? And resilience is being able to navigate that complicated scenario. Before I finish, I want to thank all of you for coming. I wouldn't be who I am today without any of you. And if you think that I am doing good work or successful or a cool person, it's just a reflection of all you in the room and all of you online who have supported me for so long. And I'd also like to thank the people who paid me for the last couple of years. So the National Science Foundation, National Research Foundation of Korea, which sent me to Korea twice, and the U.S. Department of Defense have all been very supportive of this work. Thank you all so much for coming. And that's my dissertation.